Okay, we're back for part two of this background explanation and read through of the prison slave as Gemini's silent scandal. And the concept here is what is Wilderson's criticism of the Gramscian war on position and the idea of counter-hegemonic struggle, which is the basis for his claim about pessimism. The essay very early on, at the bottom of the first page and the top of the second page, 18 and 19, is discussing the biographical account of Assata Shakur, a member of the Black Panther Party, later collaborating with a number of prison abolitionists. And the prison abolitionists in this case are white movement members, and Wilderson quotes her as saying in her biography, with no more than 3 words, her recollection becomes a matter of fact and unfiltered. She writes, "I hated it. At the time, I felt anything below 110th Street was another country. All my activities were centered in Harlem, and I almost never left it. Doing defense committee work was definitely not up my alley. I hated standing around all these white people while all these white people asked me to explain myself, my existence. I became a master of the one-liner." And Wilderson's gloss on this moment is, quote, "Here's the moment in her life as a prison slave in waiting, which is to say, a moment as an ordinary Black person when she finds herself among friends," quotes, "abolitionists, at least partners in purpose, and yet she feels it necessary to adopt the same muscular constriction, the same coiled anticipation, the same combative one-liners that she will need to adopt just 1 year later to steel herself against the encroachment of prison guards. The verisimilitude between Assata's well-known police encounters and her experiences in civil society's most nurturing nook, the Radical Coalition, raises disturbing questions about political desire, Black positionality, and hegemony as a mode of struggle." So that's the questions about hegemony as a mode of struggle. Working backwards, questions about hegemony as a mode of struggle are posed by Black positionality and the disturbing analogy between supposedly allied relationships in civil society and encounters with the police. Notice that Wilderson here refers to the prison slave in waiting and equates that with the experience of the, quote, ordinary Black person. And Wilderson's point here is that at its best, or best, in terms of shared purpose, that is the abolition movement, that he says that the position of Blackness in that situation is not truly different from the most confrontational and antagonistic elements of public life, that is the encounter with the police. And according to Wilderson, this is because of the way in which the experience of Blackness in civil society is based on constitutive exclusion. And he begins to draw on here the work of Franz Fanon, kind of famous anti-colonial psychoanalyst, and he says on page 19, quote, "In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon makes 2 moves with respect to civil society. First, he locates its genuine manifestation in Europe, the motherland. Then, with respect to the colony, he locates it only in the zone of the settler. This second move is vital for our understanding of Black positionality in America and for understanding the, at best, limitations of radical social movements in America. For if we were to follow Fanon's analysis and the gestures towards his understanding in some work of imprisoned intellectuals, then we have to come to grips with the fact that for Black people, civil society itself, rather than its abuses or shortcomings, is a state of emergency." So we've talked in the topic lecture and some other places about criticism is related to problem definition. And here, if you were to, Wilderson is distinguishing between problems that you might name with the abuses or shortcomings of civil society. So things that could be met by enforcement of civil rights claims or expansion of civil rights claims, shortcomings or abuses. You could see those as the state of emergency, as the urgent problem, the emergency that must be confronted by social movements. And instead, Wilderson sees this as civil society itself is the state of emergency. So by defining the problem not as one of abuse or a shortcoming, but instead as civil society itself, Wilderson is defining Black positionality in terms of constitutive exclusion from civil society. And the quote from Fanon means that he's drawing an analogy between the colonial position and the position of blackness in America, in the United States. And that also fits with the ways in which, and this is important for some criticisms, but also for kind of locating pessimism in some of these arguments, that the colonial analogy is employed in a number of pessimist works. And this is also a place when, in discussing policing, that Wilderson references the notion of gratuitous as opposed to contingent violence on that same page 19, and this notion of the Manichean divide. So, that's a divide that can't be bridged. That's another term here being used to amplify the idea of an antagonism that can't be reconciled, that's endless, that can't be transformed, and that the violence faced by blackness in relationship to the police is not a contingent violence. It's not an issue of abuse. It's not, the state of emergency isn't, one particular confrontation with a police officer or an encounter with the police, but the police. The police are themselves the state of emergency. And the gratuitousness of violence here refers to the way in which the violence faced by blackness as a position in terms of policing is not it's not grounded in rationality. It's not grounded in exploitation. So part of his critique, we'll get into this in a minute, about the kind of difference between slave and worker in Wilderson's argument and his criticism of Gramsci, but part of the claim here is that exploitation of the worker is oftentimes in this scheme is a rational form of violence. It's instrumental. It's a way of achieving another end. So, that you engage in significant control of the working class as a capitalist in order to get something from them, to exploit them, to get more out of the time that they spend laboring. But that here, in the encounter between the police and blackness, in civil society and blackness, there's not a rational basis or a rational end that's being sought. The violence is gratuitous. And part of the reason that this is significant is he's drawing on Fanon, who, as I mentioned, is a psychoanalyst. And so part of the argument is connected to the way in which the gratuity of violence directed at blackness is grounded in the way in which the psychoanalytic account of the psyche foregrounds the ways in which the psyche isn't rational. It's not all in it. It's drawing on a Lacanian and thus a Freudian account of the way in which human behavior, its drives and desires, are not grounded in some kind of completely rational, easily calculable and kind of assigned set of interests, but instead that there are irrational elements to human drives and human behaviors that aren't really accounted for in civil society. We usually think of civil society and political theory as the place where you're articulating public reasons for the actions that we might undertake or the kind of solutions that we might seek out to particular problems. And here, that part of what's going on is a criticism of the way in which that account of behavior and argument and reason giving in civil society leaves out and cannot account for important non-rational or irrational elements in human behavior and in the human psyche. So working down the kind of next couple pages in the essay on page 20, Wilderson further explores this relationship between policing and whiteness. And he's quoting from Martin and Sexton here. And this is a quote from page 20. Wilderson says, Martin and Sexton, this Manichean delirium manifests itself by, according to them, this Manichean delirium manifests itself by way of the US paradigm of policing that reproduces repetitively the inside-outside, the civil society/black world, by virtue of the difference between those bodies that do not magnetize bullets and those that do. Police impunity serves to distinguish between the racial itself and the elsewhere that mandates it, the distinction between those whose human being is permanently put in question and for those whom goes without saying. So a couple of the important divides that are being staked out here. First of all, to repeat that notion of Manichaean division is a division or a dichotomous opposition that can't be bridged, can't be transcended. You can't get outside of it. You can't get beyond it. And so the terms here, inside, outside, civil society, the black world, that gets at that notion of constitutive exclusion again. Okay, and the difference being defined by bodies that magnetize bullets and those that do not, as in those that are subject to gratuitous violence and those that are not. And that also maps onto this idea of those whose human being is put permanently into question and those for whom it goes without saying. So if you were to think about the Gramscian terms that we've been talking about common sense and hegemonic understandings, in one version of that, you might think about that division between those whose human being is put into question and those whom it goes without saying as a contingent relationship or a contingent opposition, that the humanity of some is under question but could be rectified, that that civil society could recognize their claims to be fully human, to be recognized as deserving of the rights of human rights or of civil rights. So to be recognized as human, to be deserving of human rights, to be recognized as a citizen or a member of a community that is to be deserving of civil rights, and to be a subject of civil rights. Here, when Wilderson says those whose human being is put permanently into question, that gets again at this idea of an antagonism that can't be bridged. Okay. And then he further connects this to the way in which whiteness then is not in a contingent relationship to policing, but is instead synonymous with the police. So, quote, they are, if only by default, deputized, they meaning white people, are deputized against those who do magnetize bullets. In short, white people are not simply protected by the police, they are, in their very corporeality, that is their bodily form, the police. So whiteness embodies the police. It is not simply this kind of other position that is protected by the police, but policing is intrinsic in the claim of whiteness. To be white is to be the police, to be policing black life, and to be policing black bodies. And that's this notion of a structural antagonism, right? The dividing line and who is on which side of the line and how is it drawn. This unbridgeable gap between those who magnetize bullets and those who do not, or the police and blackness, right? Now we're getting at some sense of why this is a powerful criticism, not only of many forms of criminal justice reform, but even of something like abolition. If the most radical form of civil demand is something that nevertheless is going to end up embodying the police, even in its opposition in theory to the prison industrial complex, like if to be white is to be the police and to be a member of civil society is to be not black, and to be on the other side of that Manichaean divide, then that means that even an abolitionist civil claim is still ultimately rests on a position that is equivalent to policing or equivalent to the police. So essentially that abolitionism from the perspective of Wilderson's argument about black positionality is impossible. There is no possibility of abolition because of the way in which to be in civil society is to be subject to the power of the police, to be subject to the police. So this means then that this is a fundamental criticism of even the most radical civil movements. And that's where we get on the next couple pages 20 and 21, this kind of longer quote, the section that I'll explain next, that's then a criticism of any strategy that revolves around the claims that you might make in civil society on behalf of those who are subject to violence on the part of the police. So, quote, any serious musing on the question of antagonistic identity formation, a formation the mass mobilization of which can precipitate a crisis in the institutions and assumptive logic that undergird the United States of America, must come to grips with the contradictions between the political demands of radical social movements, such as the large prison abolition movement, which seeks to abolish the prison industrial complex, and the ideological structure that underwrites its political desire. So to unpack that first part for a moment, right? We've talked about antagonistic identity formation. I hope that term, that set of terms feels clearer now. And this phrase, the mass mobilization of which can precipitate a crisis in the institutions and assumptive logic, that's that moment of a transition from war of position to war of movement. The moment in which the struggle becomes an antagonistic revolutionary one that seeks to overthrow the kind of the logic of the system, the logic that fits these different elements or pieces together. So from the topic lecture on abolition, right, the abolitionist position is a critique of the paradigms of criminal justice, either rehabilitative, deterrent, or retributive paradigms, and it puts the elements like criminal or criminality in an entirely different relationship than you find in any of those positions. And so in that way, from an abolitionist perspective, the abolitionists believe that the demand for prison abolition gets at, the kind of logic that undergirds a bunch of these institutions of civil society, a carceral logic, right? We talked about that in the topic lecture, that a logic is a system of rules for putting different elements together. Okay, and Wilderson's argument here is that there are contradictions between prison abolition and the ideological structure that underwrites its political desire. That is, the desire for recognition, to solicit civil society, to solicit hegemonic groups, that ideological structure cannot accommodate the positionality of Blackness. Wilderson continues, I contend that the positionality of Black subjectivity is at the heart of these contradictions, and that this unspoken desire is bound up with the political limitations of several naturalized and uncritically accepted categories that have their genesis mainly in the works of Antonio Gramsci, namely work or labor, the wage, exploitation, hegemony, and civil society. So those are all of the terms that we've defined thus far, and we've talked about the way in which work or wage labor, exploitation, and kind of instrumental violence or contingent violence, and hegemony and civil society, that those terms fit together. Wilderson's going to put those all of those terms into question, right? Quote, I wish to theorize the symptoms of rage and resignation I hear in the words of George Jackson when he boils reform down to a single word, fascism, or in Assata's brief declaration, I hated it, as well as in the Manichean delirium of Fanon, Martineau, and Sexton. Today, the failure of radical social movements to embrace symptoms of all three gestures is tantamount to the reproduction of an anti-Black politics that nevertheless represents itself as being in the service of the emancipation of the Black prison slave. So, right, we get at this notion that reform is the equivalent of fascism, that in the same way that the argument about whiteness not being protected by the police, but whiteness is the police or is policing, right? Then that means that reform or re-articulation of the relationship between white civil society and its antagonistic Black other, that since there's no reconciliation, that reform is tantamount to fascism, is a disguise for white authority and white supremacy. And that notion that this reproduces an anti-Black politics is that, despite the declarations that this is about emancipation, that abolition is about emancipation, think about the correlation between those terms, right? Abolition draws on this history of abolitionist rhetoric to say, for instance, if you accept the kind of account of the US criminal justice system found in the new Jim Crow, right, that we need a neo-abolitionist movement. We draw on the rhetoric of abolitionism to say that a new form of prison abolition is necessary rather than only the abolition of slavery, because slavery as a legal category lives on in the prison industrial complex. Its name has been changed. Some of its features have been altered, but the core relationship is still there. For Wilderson, that core relationship would persist even in the instance of prison abolition. Okay. By examining the strategy and structure of the Black subject's absence in and incommensurability, as in incommensurable, something that can't be measured on the same measuring stick. There's no way to speak to a common measure. Incommensurability with the key categories of Gramscian theory, we come face to face with three unsettling consequences. One, the Black American subject imposes a radical incoherence upon the assumptive logic of Gramscian discourse and on today's politics. In other words, he implies a scandal. So to unpack that first part, that if he's about to start the argument about the difference between slave and worker, and thus between Black positionality and the exploited worker in Gramscian or Marxist theory. Okay, if those two things can't be measured on the same yardstick, if they're incommensurable, then there's no way to translate the demands or the kind of the rage that's found in the Black position into the logic of the war of position. Okay. Wilderson continues, 2, the Black subject reveals the inability of social movements grounded in Gramscian discourse to think of white supremacy rather than capitalism as the base, and thereby calls into question their claim to elaborate a comprehensive and decisive antagonism. Stated another way, Gramscian discourse and coalition politics are indeed able to imagine the subject that transforms itself into a mass of antagonistic identity formations that can precipitate a crisis in wage slavery, exploitation, and hegemony, but they are asleep at the wheel when asked to provide enabling antagonisms towards unwaged slavery, despotism, and terror, right? Terror here correlating with the police, with the gratuitous violence that we find in the way in which whiteness is itself a form of policing. And that all of the positions that are related to capitalism as the kind of core structural logic of our society cannot account for the way in which, in fact, white supremacy and the legacy of slavery is both a precursor to and a requirement for capitalism in Wilderson's argument. And we'll unpack that in a moment. Wilderson continues, 3, we begin to see how Marxism suffers from a kind of conceptual anxiety. There is a desire for socialism on the other side of crisis, a society that does away not with the category of worker, but with the imposition that workers suffer under the approach of variable capital. In other words, exploitation. Okay. Wilderson continues, in other words, the mark of its conceptual anxiety is in its desire to democratize work and thus to help keep in place and ensure the coherence of Reformation and Enlightenment foundational values of productivity and progress. This scenario crowds out other post-revolutionary possibilities, i.e. idleness. Okay, so here we go back to that kind of notion of the way in which the liberal tradition, being grounded in Reformation and the end of a comprehensive vision of the good life, Enlightenment rationality, that in Wilderson's view, that Marxism has taken up that set of terminology, or that the undergirding values of productivity and progress. Okay, he's essentially, accusing even Marxists of being committed to a set of bourgeois values and also white supremacist values because of the way in which the very categories of civil society are bound up in whiteness. And that, the contrast here between the idea of a democratized work versus idleness, that those are demands that can't be reconciled. They don't exist in the same, they don't use the same vocabulary. They cannot use the same, they don't come from the same position. Okay, and this is grounded in one of Wilderson's core claims, that is that the position of the slave is completely distinct from the position of the worker. Okay, and Wilderson draws here on the work of Orlando Patterson and his comparative history of slavery called Slavery and Social Death. And the core position here being that slavery is a form of social death, that it is characterized by three characteristics: gratuitous violence, general dishonor, and natal alienation. So gratuitous violence, that is what we talked about earlier, that the violence expressed in power relationships grounded towards the slave is not grounded in rationality. So that's where you get that notion of terror, right? And despotism, that there is their domination, not hegemony. It is a relationship of dominance, not a hegemonic one. It is not exercised with any degree of consent. The slave doesn't sign a contract. They are taken as a slave against their will. It's a relationship immediately of terror, dominance, and coercion. And general dishonor, that that recognition of the slave in civil society there is no possible recognition. There's no honor that could be accrued from that position. And natal alienation, there's no heritability, that passing down property, passing down inheritance, to be a member of the community as being born into that community. So for instance, this calls it, if you think about the way in which birthright citizenship is important for the Constitution of the United States, right? He's drawing on some ways in which Black slavery in the United States, that to be born in the United States yet to have none of the rights of a citizen, that corresponds to natal alienation. One is natally alienated from the community and is also uprooted from one's community of birth. Okay, that's the basis for the concept that the slave is not a worker. And if the slave is not a worker, then that means that any of the demands that we might find for what we see as the Gramscian war of position cannot take into account the way in which the slave's position is a scandal, right? That it scandalizes this set of strategies and claims because the slave's claims cannot be articulated in terms of civil rights and a right to non-exploitation, to equal protection before the law, kind of all the civil rights and liberal demands that we discussed above. To quote Wilderson further on page 22, quote, "The positionality of the slave makes a demand that is in excess of the demand made by the positionality of the worker. The worker demands that productivity be fair and democratic, Gramsci's new hegemony, Lenin's dictatorship of the proletariat, in a word, socialism. In contrast, the slave demands that production stop without recourse to its ultimate democratization. Work is not an organic principle for the slave. The absence of Black subjectivity from the crux of radical discourse is symptomatic of the text's inability to cope with the possibility that the generative subject of capitalism, the Black body of the 15th and 16th centuries, and the generative subject that resolves late capital's overaccumulation crisis, the Black incarcerated body of the 20th and 21st centuries, do not reify the basic categories that structure conflict within civil society, the categories of work and exploitation. Thus, the Black subject position in America represents an antagonism or a demand that cannot be satisfied through a transfer of ownership or an organization of existing rubrics." So that could also be ownership in terms of the right to, in terms of civil rights, the things that are proper to a citizen, that, the property of a citizen, the United States, their civil rights, that redistributing civil rights claims here, what Wilderson is saying is that any of these vocabularies that draw on rights claims are ultimately equivalent to the workers' demand for non-exploitation, for democratized work. Okay, and at the beginning of that paragraph, Wilderson makes the case that capitalism is dependent upon slavery for its existence. And there are a whole series of historical debates about the relationship between capitalism and slavery. I think in some ways, especially in recent historical study and historiography, it's become less controversial to make the case that Black slavery and that Black slavery is critical for the development of capitalism. Like I said, there are many different claims made by a lot of different people on that argument. But I also don't think that, to accept the idea that slavery is to use Wilderson's terminology, jumpstarts capitalism. I don't think that all of the people who take that position, they're not all pessimists. For instance, there are a number of Black Marxists who make that argument, but do not then subsequently accept Wilderson's argument that slave and worker are then totally distinct, that these positions cannot be reconciled or articulated in terms of one another. Another thing to note from this paragraph, and one of the parting thoughts that we'll have for just this backgrounder, is this notion of, Wilderson himself is drawing on some of these arguments about the way in which the overaccumulation crisis of capitalism, so late capitalism, that the Black incarcerated body of the 20th and 21st is equivalent to the Black body of the 15th and 16th centuries, that is the slave who jumpstarts capitalism. So, in that way, there is an argument being made that in some way resembles some of the new Jim Crow style argument, but in Wilderson's terms, it's entirely different, because it isn't that there is the afterlife of slavery that has evolved into another set of categories that need to be confronted on new terms, that is with neo-abolitionist perspectives or neo-abolitionist rhetoric. It's that they are actually the same, and that the scandal of any of the kind of war of position that you might find in abolitionism or in Marxism, that war of position is itself inextricably bound up in the fact that to make any even very radical claim in the terms of civil society and in the arena of civil society is to automatically accept the underlying logic of white supremacy that underwrites or undergirds all of civil society itself, those kind of Enlightenment rationality values of productivity and progress that were cited in the earlier paragraph. Given the amount of time that this backgrounder is taken up already, I'm going to stop unpacking this essay there. There are several pages to go that are important and bring up some different arguments about kind of the inability to articulate Black positionality in terms of these Gramscian categories, and in particular the idea here of Blackness as anti-human rather than contingently non-human or contingently subhuman that's covered in the later part of this essay. But we'll leave that for the beginning of the elective or the beginning of our conversation in lab. So thanks very much. I hope that that's helpful for understanding some of the foundational pessimist arguments against abolitionism and against the notion of even radical movements in civil society that forms the basis for this kind of pessimistic relationship to even the most radical demands. And we'll take it up from there in terms of some of the responses or criticisms that you might find, as well as a further articulation of the end of Wilderson's claim about the relationship between Black positionality and humanity. But for now, thanks very much.